The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
Welcome to Getting to Know You. My name is Joe Nash. Today we're going to be talking about Grant Cottage. It's right up at exit 16 on the Northway. It is where Ulysses S. Grant died, and it's a historical site. It's open from Memorial Day to Labor Day, Wednesdays through Sundays, 10 to 4, and Tuesdays during the track season. They have all kinds of events up there we're going to talk about, and it's a great historical place to go to. We have with us Tim Welch. He is the president of the Board of Trustees of the Friends of Grant Cottage. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you, Joe.
It's coming down. It's a long title you have there. So.
Yes, well, you could abbreviate it. Just call me Mr. Tim.
Mr. Tim, okay. So how long have you been involved with, before we talk about the cottage as a historical site, how long have you been involved with that?
About 10 years. Somebody who knew I was really interested in history got me on the board. And then 7 years ago, because I drew the short straw, they made me president.
And you're still president.
And I'm still president, so I guess...
So you said people knew your interest in history. What is your interest in history?
Well, I just read everything I can get my hands on about military history, and even not so much about the Civil War. But having had an interest in history, I realized what a great story General Grant had to tell, and frankly, I didn't know that story before 10 years ago.
Okay, well, you do say, I read a couple articles and I saw a little piece of a documentary you made, which I like this little quote you have. As a historical site, you said, this is not really a shrine, it's really a place where a great story took place. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I think everybody knows that Ulysses S. Grant was the general that saved the Union, it could be argued. After several failed commanders, Lincoln chose Grant because he was winning in the West that time being Tennessee and Mississippi. Vicksburg was his big battle, which was overshadowed at the time by that little place down in southern part of Pennsylvania called Gettysburg. Since both of those events happened in the same weekend, nobody knows about Vicksburg, but arguably Grant winning the fortress of Vicksburg, which guarded the Mississippi, was the real turning point in the Civil War, because it cut the Confederacy in half. It cut it off from Texas, and it allowed the Union to control this vital waterway. And because Grant was winning in the West, he was brought to the East to face the Marble Man, Robert E. Lee, who everybody said was so wonderful. And everybody knows about that, and he became a two-term president, and
famous for having many scandals in his administration.
Allegedly having a lot of scandals, but they actually started in the previous administration. Many of them did. The Johnson administration, a guy who was in fact impeached. But in many ways, Grant gets a bad rap because everybody hated both North and South, this thing after the Civil War called Reconstruction. And it was something that failed. And so they associate Grant's two terms with a failed major event in American history called Reconstruction.
Okay. Well, one of the things I do at the library here, I order books for many years, more than I can count, for history and biographies. And I would say the last 10 years or so, there's been a lot of new biographies of Grant, and there was an annotated edition of his memoirs just came out.
Yes.
There's now, I think recently just came out a book of the letters between him and his wife. And historians, you know how they like to do these polls of Grant the presidents. He's sort of going through they've been reassessing him. I don't know if have you been following that in any
Yes,
of
absolutely,
books?
And it's warmed the cockles of my heart to see that his reputation is being rehabilitated.
He's really sort of entering the second tier, it seems like. For a long time, he was considered sort of at the bottom, wasn't he?
Well, he was written off as a drunk and a butcher.
Yeah.
Now, he did have a problem with alcohol, and one of the books you referred to, Ron Chernow's Grant, has 138 pages in it where Grant's drinking is mentioned. And it really ticks off people like us who say the real story should be that Grant overcame his weakness for alcohol, never really used it during battles, only used it before the Civil War to any extent while he was away from his wife. And he really drank out of loneliness because the life of a soldier at that time, before the Civil War, was lonely. You were out in the middle of nowhere. You may have been an Indian fighter, and officers drank.
Yeah, well, that's...
It's what they did. Officers drank, and he couldn't hold his liquor.
But he is being reassessed as now considered actually a pretty good president.
And a very good general, and arguably better than Robert E. Lee.
Oh.
And many people say that there was a period of time in the late 1800s and early 1900s when the northern liberal establishment at the time in academic circles allowed the South to reinvent their history and represent the Civil War as just an opportunity for states' rights. It had little or nothing to do with slavery, and that the heroic effort on the part of the overwhelmed Southern aristocracy to assert itself was overwhelmed by the industrialization and the additional manpower of the North. And the only reason Grant won was because he was lucky and he had so many more men.
Well, Tim, you have been doing your history, it sounds like. So now that you fill us all in, how did he end up in Wilton, New York at the Mount McGregor?
Very good question, Joe. And we have documented that Grant came to Saratoga Springs at least 3 times before
he was dying.
He was dying in 1885. So we have him coming to crew races on Saratoga Lake in 1874. We have a picture of him on the porch of the then Union Hotel before it became the Grand Union Hotel.
Right there on Main Street.
Right, on Broadway in 1869. And that's when he was just took office as president in 1869. Back then you took office on March 4th. And so this was in September of 1869. He's on the porch of what was to be the Grand Union Hotel. Very sharp-looking young man with the owner of the hotel, Mr. Leland Stanford. And Grant really liked Saratoga Springs. Saratoga Springs was the place where the rich and famous came from Boston and New York City by train to take the healing waters and bet on horses.
Well, it still is to some extent.
And it still is. And it's health, history, and horses is what Saratoga Springs is all about, and Grant is a big part of that history part.
So how did he end up, after these visits, up at Mount McGregor and down in, how did that story? I know it's sort of he was dying, he was broke, Mark Twain's involved, there's a whole big story here.
Well, there's another interesting part of the story, and that was that Grant had accumulated about $200,000 in cash as a result of having gifts given to him. He had a world tour. After he got out of the presidency for 2.5 years, he got all kinds of gifts. He went to 30 different countries. He was the most famous person in the world in the 1870s because he was from this hot dog new country called America. He was a general that had created this new form of industrialized warfare and trench warfare. So he was greeted and he was president, of course, for 2 terms, an American president of a democracy. So he went to all these places all over the world. He went to China, Japan, Russia. Bismarck met him in Germany, Queen Victoria. So he had all these. He was covered by the international press. So he was the most famous person in the world.
And yet he was broke.
And yet he got into a Ponzi scheme. A bank on Wall Street, Ferdinand Ward, started a bank with Grant's son. Grant's son got him into it. Grant put all his money into this bank, another stupid move. He wasn't diversified. The bank failed. Ferdinand Ward wasn't really investing it. Grant wound up with like $160 in his checking account by the end of 1884, and he found out he had terminal throat cancer the same time.
And this is when he came up.
This is when Mark Twain came to him and said, listen, I hear you've been offered a contract for 10% of the royalties to write your memoirs. I'll guarantee you 70% because they have no idea how many people would want to buy your book.
Now, was Mark Twain acting on behalf of himself or for a publisher?
Well, he put his brother-in-law up as a publisher.
Oh, okay.
He brought his brother-in-law. Mark Twain is another great story, as you probably know.
He was involved in many schemes also.
He lost more money than Grant ever thought of losing. He was just a bad businessman. But he picked Grant as somebody who could write a best-selling book. And so he got him a stenographer because he knew Grant only had 9-10 months to live.
And he had throat cancer.
Terminal throat cancer. And by the time they saw it, they did have some rudimentary medicine at that time. They did bleed him. They injected him with
well, didn't they put some
there
kind
was
of...
some sort of liqueur.
They did have some kind of cocaine mixture to...
They also had...
On his-
cocaine was available at that time. So was morphine, opium. And he didn't want the opium and the morphine because it clouded his brain, he said, and he was trying to write. So instead, they would bathe his throat with a mixture of water and cocaine, and it gave him topical relief from the pain of... But by the time he was at Mount McGregor, he couldn't speak, he couldn't eat. He was just making notes on paper in pencil, only pencil, and we have his pencils, and he used to sharpen them himself with a penknife.
So when he got up there, he was about halfway done with the memoirs?
He was done with Volume 1.
Okay.
He was finishing Volume 2, and Twain went up there at least twice. The first time telling him, you can't make any changes to Volume 1. We're already typesetting it. And he said, I wanted to make... And Twain said to him, you don't have time to make changes.
Oh, jeez.
You've got to finish Volume 2. And so he helped him do that. And again, Grant provided him Twain provided Grant a stenographer because by this time, by this time, there's no point in having a stenographer. He could only write. Nobody could hear him. He couldn't talk.
Oh, my God.
But he had a stenographer the first 6 months of the process of putting the book together.
And he, at the site, Mount McGregor, Grant Cottage, he literally sat on that porch for, it 2 months? And
the porch and also inside. I have a picture of that I brought with me of the last photograph ever taken of Grant on July 20th, 1885, 3 or 4 days before he died.
Okay. And then, so he finishes the book. Did he actually finish it? And then
he did finish it. He finished it 3 or 4 days before he died. Twain took it to the press, and within a year after it was sold, Julia Grant, his wife, got the equivalent of $11 million in today's money, $450,000 in 1886 dollars.
Well, it was an immense bestseller, and it has gone on to be, it's always been in print. There's many editions. It's also considered one of the greatest American autobiographies, isn't it? I mean,
yes, certainly military autobiographies and biographies of a president. And it's not written in this flowery Victorian prose that we might be familiar with. Many people believe that Grant was a great general because his orders were so clear. In the fog of war, even though they had a telegraph back then, once you commissioned your officers to take off and bring 2 regiments to this creek and do this, before sundown, all that stuff had to be quite specific and in sequential
so
order.
He wrote
all of his own orders in his own hand, and in a very precise use of the language.
Well, that's a good. I have never heard that theory about him. Okay. So
they also say that his best subject, and he didn't have a lot of good ones, was mathematics at West Point.
Okay.
And they say about Napoleon's great forte on the battlefield was his ability to do howitzer trajectories in his head, where he would know where to place the cannons, know how much powder and what the elevation should be to have it hit the enemy. And they said Grant could do that as well.
All right.
Because his best subject was mathematics.
Okay. So when people come to the cottage, I mentioned their hours and everything. What are some of the things I understand? It is literally hasn't been changed since the day he died. The place is exactly. They haven't moved anything.
That's our mission, to keep everything just the way it was in the summer of 1885, 134 years ago now, and. That's our mission, and we're the only state historic site without any state employees.
Oh, okay.
In fact, the state was going to close Mount
That's right,
McGregor.
the Friends, you guys took it over, the Friends.
In 1985, when the state was in some financial difficulty, they did not have the money to keep it staffed. So we formed, I wasn't part of it then, I've only been, but 30 years ago this year, the Friends group, the Friends of Grant Cottage, was formed to keep it open. And we keep it open about 6 months every year, just in the warmer months, because it's on top of this mountain and it's very hard to get to, certainly in the wintertime. And we charge $6 a pop to take people through on a guided tour of the place, and that's what keeps it open.
And then as you're talking, we'll see some pictures on the screen. What are some of the things people will see?
Well, they'll see in his own handwriting, his own writing, his notes, some of the notes that were taken on his manuscript of the book. You'll see his shaving gear, his bath clothes. He had, because he was broke, he had given his uniforms away to William Vanderbilt, who he borrowed $150,000 from to try to bail out Grant and Ward, the Ponzi scheme he was a part of. William Vanderbilt donated them to the U.S. government, but Grant didn't have much of anything when he came to, and you'll also see the vial of cocaine that his doctors were using to bathe his throat. He had 2 doctors up there at the time that he was suffering.
And the house and the furnishings are just
everything's just the way it was back then, including all the pictures on the wall, including a prominent one of Lincoln.
And isn't there something about a clock is stopped at the time or something?
The clock was stopped at 8 minutes after 8 on the morning of July 23rd, 1885, the last time he drew a breath.
Okay, and then there's something about, I'm not sure I got the word right, his funeral, the flower, what was that, the cortege, or what's that?
Yes, well, there are several sections to the funeral. First of all, there was a funeral ceremony on the cottage porch a couple days afterwards. Also, he was embalmed up there by a funeral home that still exists in Saratoga Springs and will remain nameless because they screwed it up. Now, embalming was a it was something that was just developed during the Civil War to try to get bodies from the south, where it was really hot, up to the north for funerals so that families could bury people. And they had some combination of formaldehyde and other chemicals to basically prevent the decomposition. And they were still getting that formula right in 1885. He turned black, apparently, and had to be re-embalmed when he got down to New York City by train because he was lying in state at City Hall in New York City.
Well, Tim, you've demonstrated your knowledge of history. This is very interesting. Let me just ask you then, since you are so enthralled with this, why should people visit these kind of sites?
Well, I think it's important in an era when history seems to be something that is no longer something that people want to major in college. You know, I'm in the communications department, communication and media department at SUNY. We have 650 majors. The history department has 88 majors.
Oh, wow.
And I'm very sad about that. I think that history is not only a great way to train the mind, but it's a great way to transmit information about how we have evolved and the fact that we have built whatever we have on the shoulders of very smart people who have come before us. And it's great stories like this that are very rewarding, if not intellectually stimulating.
And then do you have an interest in other, you said military and Grant, what are some of your other historical interests?
Well, I have a lot of them. One of the things that we did last summer as a way to raise money for Grant Cottage, which we're always trying to do to keep it open, is to have a Civil War weekend, as we called it, and we had 100 reenactors from all over the Northeast United States and 30 Confederates from Montreal.
Okay.
Remember, Canada was not our friend during the Civil War. All of the Confederates came from Montreal. They were all dressed up. They had 2 different camps. They brought cannon, and we had 24 horses, and they had mock battles on a field just below Grant Cottage in the town of Wilton to help celebrate the 200th anniversary of the town of Wilton.
Well, I should say, if you go to the website, it's grantcottage.org. There's no events up yet, but over the summer, they have, besides tours, they have like music, they have lectures, they have historical reenactors, not just soldiers, but someone who does like Grant.
Yep.
And you have like little festival-like events, and sometimes they're all on the same day. You might have music, you might have a lecture all at once.
And another important thing that happened, Joe, is that Ron Chernow, as a librarian. He is the writer of the most recent and perhaps famous book on Grant called Grant. He did his research 3 years ago for that book by coming up to Grant Cottage. And we talked to him, and he asked us some questions and everything. Okay. And then he forgot his notebook. Okay. And he was here for, it was kind of a twofer because he was giving an address at Skidmore College at the same time. And we called his hotel and made arrangements to get the notebook back to him. So we're trying to get him back up there to talk about his best-selling book called Grant, where he really goes a long way to rehabilitating Grant's, let us say, reputation.
Well, like I say, it's only one of many the last 6 or 7 years or so. And then the brand new, we just got it a couple months ago. There's the memoirs, this big annotated edition. I don't know if you've seen it. It's got all kinds of
from Mississippi State, which is really where, ironically enough, Mississippi State is the place where Grant's papers are.
Oh, okay.
There's a good story there, but we don't have enough time.
All right, so Tim, thanks for telling us about Grant Cottage. It's open from Memorial Day to Labor Day, Wednesdays through Sundays 10 to 4, and it's only $6 admission, and it has. You get the tour, and then watch it on the website over the summer because there's all kinds of events like reenactors, and you're open on Tuesdays during the track season. Do you get a lot of the track people on that?
We
Tuesday?
do.
Oh, okay.
We get a lot of people who want to do something other than parimutuel wagering.
They need a day off from that,
or they need they've only got $6 left, and they want to find a good way of spending it.
And you're also open on 3 Mondays, the 3 holidays, Memorial Day, Labor Day, and Columbus Day. And I don't know, are there special events?
We are open only on weekends after Labor Day through Columbus Day.
Oh, through Columbus, I'm sorry. So Memorial Day sounds like an appropriate day to open. Well, thanks for coming down, Tim. Appreciate it. And we will see you next time on Getting to Know You.
When the town of Wilton was less than 60 years old in 1885, the guy who was probably the most famous person in America, maybe in the world, the guy who had saved the Union and become a 2-term president of this great new country called America, he came here to Mount McGregor because he was dying and he was broke. So Grant worked with Mark Twain, another famous author at that time, to publish his histories of his generalship during the Civil War. Because in this way, he could overcome poverty and cheat death by actually, after selling 350,000 copies, his wife got the equivalent in today's money of $11 million. So we like to think that Ulysses S. Grant came to Mount McGregor and won his final battle, a final battle over poverty and throat cancer. Ulysses S. Grant was broke because his son got him into a Ponzi scheme, and he lost all his money. Grant Cottage reenactor Steve Trim describes the early process of drafting his memoirs before he came to Wilton.
The beginning, before the cancer really took hold, cancer of the mouth, the throat, the tongue, I could dictate, and I sat and told stories about my family history, the Mexican War, the Civil War, and the stenographer wrote everything down. I just spun the stories and had no particular plan at all. And I think that perhaps to a degree irritated my editor, Mark Twain, because he was an editor. He knew some stories were better than others, so I left it to him to do the editing. I basically threw in everything I could remember.
1885 was a terrible year for the Grant family, and longtime volunteer Steve Trim tells us why Grant came to Mount McGregor to finish his memoirs despite suffering from terminal throat cancer.
My wife and I were living in New York City. That is where I was diagnosed with cancer. By the spring of 1885, as I said, most of the book was done, but not quite. And my doctors believed that if I stayed in the city, there was a heat wave coming, that the conditions would so aggravate my medical condition that I might be pushed right over the edge. So they looked around for a place with fresh, clean, unpolluted air. The theory being if they could relocate me, the new environment would prolong my life and I would have time to finish the book. My friend, Joseph Drexel, owned a cottage on Mount McGregor in the town of Wilton, New York. He offered the cottage to the family and to me for free for as long as we might need it, and that's why we came to Wilton in 1885.
Grant died just days after completing his memoirs on Mount McGregor, and this image is the last photograph ever taken of the American icon on the porch of what was then called Drexel Cottage.
When Mark Twain, my publisher, came here, he was encouraging me to accelerate the process of ending the book, but my family urged me to go slow because they saw in my focus on the writing and my devotion to the project that it was actually prolonging my life. It was giving me something to live for, and I don't disagree. Well, my whole family was here. It had been years since the entire family was together. It's my 4 adult children, my grandchildren. And in a way, it was one of the happiest times of my life because we were all together and we could look back over the years together and the wonderful family adventures we had had together. So in a sense, I was in physical pain, but emotionally, I'm not sure I've ever been happier.
When Grant died on Mount McGregor, there was a funeral at the cottage, and then the train that brought him here took him back down the mountain through Saratoga Springs and to Albany. Here's an image from August 6th of 1885 as the general's coffin was taken up State Street, where a viewing of the body would occur in the newly built State Capitol building up at the top of the hill. Then the train took Grant down to New York City, where on the 8th of August, the biggest procession in American history was staged over a 7-mile section of Broadway to the East River, where we now have Grant's tomb. After U.S. Grant left Mount McGregor, the cottage became a hallowed site, where groups of Civil War veterans would pitch tents to protect the place where the great man died from souvenir hunters and looters. In 1897, the 100-room Balmoral Hotel at the summit was destroyed by fire, and many thought that was the last chapter to be written in the history of the mountain. But in 1913, the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company purchased 1,200 acres of Mount McGregor to build a tuberculosis sanitarium for up to 350 patients. In 1945, New York State purchased the facility from Metropolitan to take care of convalescing veterans returning from the battles of World War II. In 1960, the state converted many of the buildings to house the developmentally disabled. And then, in 1976, the complex was converted into a prison called the Mount McGregor Correctional Facility. In July of 2014, Mount McGregor Prison was closed and was put up for sale. And while some interest has been shown in privatizing the 325-acre prison property, its future remains uncertain.